Hello, and welcome to a quick little skill breakdown of the Phantom Necromancer's healer spec. Now, I'm not going to go too much into optimized talent and equipment builds because the game's way too young, it's way too new, and I don't think anybody has really played it enough to have an optimized build, so maybe we can talk about that in a future video. If you're looking for a skill breakdown of the Phantom Necromancer's DPS class, check out the link in the description below. Now, before I begin, I want to point out that there is another version of this skill called Soul Guard available in the skill tree, in the talent tree rather. But I'm not going to talk about that because in my experience, Soul Guard has been significantly worse than Tainted Soul for this class in dungeons and in raids, but maybe we can cover that in a future video as well. So the Phantom Necromancer's healing spec runs around two main resources. The first is called Vitality. You gain Vitality by using certain skills, which we'll talk about in a second, and every time you get 10 Vitality points, you get a Datura flower, which we can use for one specific skill, Soul Link, which we'll talk about in a bit as well. And just to point out, these little lotus buds sort of that you can see at the bottom here, each of them represents one Datura flower, and you can have a maximum of 4. So the first skill on the Phantom Necromancer is Soul Herb. Now this is a very basic heal, a single target heal that you can use in between other skills. Because the cooldown is 0, you can kind of spam this skill in between other skills just to supplement your healing and sort of like a filler skill. Now this does have a little gimmick, which is that if you don't use it for a little bit, it increases the amount of healing that it does. But I don't want you to think that that's better. You are better off just using the skill when necessary as a filler skill without worrying about letting it build up. Now the other thing about this skill is that under the right circumstances, it actually converts into a different skill called Soul Blossom. Now Soul Blossom is a very strong AoE heal, and we'll talk about how to get Soul Blossom activated in just a second when we reach the skills that can do it. But Soul Herb, in its base form, is just your basic filler healing skill. It does, however, have the ability to do damage to an enemy, but as I'll show you in just a second, the damage that's done by Soul Herb onto enemies is just so minuscule. Look at this. I'm well beyond the level of these harpies, but I'm doing barely any damage at all with Soul Herb. So really, there's really no point in using Soul Herb to damage enemies, and so I don't recommend doing so at all. Just use it to heal your allies. And in fact, with this class, you kind of are never going to be targeting enemies at any point. You're just going to be targeting allies. The next skill is Soul Draw. Now Soul Draw does a couple of things. Firstly, it does damage to all enemies around a target that you choose, around an ally that you've targeted. Then it heals that ally based on how much damage you've just done. So against bosses, this isn't a very big heal because it doesn't really do that much damage to one target. But against mobs, if the ally that you've chosen is surrounded by mobs, the amount of healing that you do is actually pretty significant because it takes into account all of the damage that you do onto those monsters. The final thing that Soul Draw does, and its primary purpose really, is that it'll give you 3 points of vitality. Remember, 10 points of vitality gives you a Datura flower, and you can have up to 4 of those Datura flowers. So this gives you 3 vitality points. The next skill is Tainted Soul. Now this actually is a pretty significant single target heal. It's a very noticeable heal, and it'll heal a chunk of their HP, so it's very nice to use when they're looking a bit low. The other thing it does is that it gives you 10 full points of vitality, which is 1 full Datura flower. So this is a very nice way to get those Datura flowers, and in fact this will be probably your main method of gaining Datura flowers. There is a caveat though to this skill, which is that after you've healed your ally, they'll lose 50% of that heal over time. So it's almost like you're healing them, let's say you're healing them 300 HP or 3000 HP, then over time they'll lose 1500 of that. So it's important to keep an eye on the allies that you heal with Tainted Soul, and then to use other single target healing abilities like Soul Draw to make sure that the HP that they lose afterwards isn't lethal. The next skill, Soul Link, is actually the bread and butter of this class. So the way that Soul Link works is that first of all, you need at least 1 Datura flower to use it. And when you do use it, you link yourself to an ally or multiple allies. In fact, the more Datura flowers you use, or the more Datura flowers you have when you use Soul Link, the more allies that you'll get linked to. In a dungeon, you'll have a team of 5, including yourself, so you want to pretty much use 4 Datura flowers to link yourself to all the allies that you're with, the entirety of your party. And in raids as well, you typically just want to use all 4 flowers at one time to use it. Now, you don't have to use all 4 of your Datura flowers at once for Soul Link. If you have 3 flowers, that'll work as well. You'll just link to 3 allies. And if you have 1 flower, that's fine too. You'll link to 1 ally. So what does linking do? Okay, linking does a couple of things. First of all, the initial target that you selected when you use Soul Link will gain a pretty hefty boost to their defense. You can see it increases it by 1,348. But this only applies to the first target that you've selected when you use Soul Link. For the rest of the linked allies, they'll share 4% of the damage that they take and the healing that they take among themselves. So basically, all the linked allies will take slightly less damage and slightly more healing when they're linked to you. So because the defense boost only applies to that initial target, it's best to select your tank before you use Soul Link so that the tank will get the defense boost and will be able to survive a lot better when they pull aggro. The final and most important thing that Soul Link does is that it converts Soul Herb into Soul Blossom. Soul Blossom is a ridiculously strong AoE heal that's able to out-heal almost any AoE damage done by a boss, and can bring your entire team back up to full. It's still better in all cases to use 4 Datura flowers when you're using Soul Link, because the more flowers you have, the more healing that Soul Blossom will end up doing. But there are cases where if a teammate is dead, or if your team is only 2 other people, you might want to use less Datura flowers when using Soul Link, so you can use Soul Link more and more often. Now you can use Soul Link on cooldown whenever it's available, and that's most of the time honestly perfectly fine, and you'll do just okay that way. But if you want to maximize your healing, and it's a particularly difficult and high end game dungeon, the best time to use Soul Link is right before an enemy does a big AoE attack. Because again, it increases the defense of your tank so that attack just doesn't hit as hard, and then you'll have Soul Blossom to get the entire team back up to full immediately after that big AoE attack. And this actually is a common theme for this class. So it does take a bit of practice and understanding of boss mechanics to get the most out of Soul Link, and in fact this is a common theme for the entire class, as you'll see in just a second. The next skill is Burning Soul. This is a pretty interesting skill because it does 3 things basically. The first one is that it'll do a pretty significant and nice single target heal to the target. The second thing is that it'll increase their max HP by 10%. So you can already kind of see that this is probably best used on tanks. If you use Burning Soul on your party tank, they'll be a bit sturdier and they'll be able to take a bit more damage before they're really in trouble. The final thing this does is it adds a heal over time to the target. Now this heal over time is actually pretty significant. It's significant enough, in fact, that for the most part, if you've given Burning Soul to your tank, you usually don't have to worry about them dying until that heal over time runs out. So you can focus your healing, your single target healing, on the other members of your party. The final skill is Soul Dance. Soul Dance is another very strong AoE heal. There are a couple of caveats to that, but for the most part, it does a lot of healing and it does it rather quickly. So in cases of emergency and you need to get your entire team back up, Soul Dance is a great option. The first caveat though is that it is a channeled skill, and if you move at all, the channeling ends. The upside though is that the healing happens in multiple parts during the channel. So you can heal a little bit and then cancel the channel, and that's okay. But for the most part, if you want to use the full channel, you kind of have to make sure that you're safe and not standing in any danger spots during a boss battle. The other caveat, of course, is that it has an absolutely ridiculously long cooldown. It's 120 seconds, which is 2 minutes. And so that means that this is really only good for emergency situations and should not be something that you're using on cooldown. The final skill is the Inscribed Stone skill. On this class, what this does is it'll convert Soul Herb into Soul Blossom for 6 seconds. So it does the same thing that Soul Link does, except without all the linking. but instead just do the Soul Herb to Soul Blossom conversion, which converts it into a big AoE heal. So it's still very, very nice. It does also add a little extra damage reduction to any allies that you're linked to, but I haven't found this to be all that significant, but it's still a nice little boost to have. So those are the skills of the Phantom Necromancer Healer. You'll notice that the first 4 skills are kind of the main 4 skills of this class, with Soul Draw and Tainted Soul being nice single target heals that you can loop between and build up those Datura flowers, throwing some Soul Herbs, not blossoms, just herbs, into the mix as filler skills just to keep those heals up, and then using Soul Link when you have 4 of those Datura flowers or however many you want to link to your allies, and then use Soul Blossom to bring them all back up right after a big AoE attack. So again, this skill is best used right before a big boss AoE, which means that to get the most out of this class, you need to understand the mechanics of the boss that you're about to fight and when they're going to use those big AoE hits. Now, there are a few things that you have to keep in mind when you're playing this class, and a few of those I've already mentioned, but I want to mention them again because they're very important to get the most out of this class. The first is that most of the abilities in this class are, in fact, single target heals. Your AoE heals require some setup and they're not always available, so for the most part, you're going to be doing single target healing, which is very different to the priest, which mostly does AoE healing. So because you're doing single target healing, you're going to need to do a lot of target switching between your allies. For me, I found the easiest way is to press escape, go to customized, and move this team area, which was here initially, all the way down here. What this does, and I'll show you that in a second, is put all of your party members one after the other here, including their HP, and it'll allow you to click between them, to switch between them very, very easily and very, very quickly. This is a huge help when it comes to doing any raid or any dungeon or anything really, because that ability to quickly switch targets is kind of essential to be a good Phantom Necromancer. The second point I want to bring up is that Soul Link isn't really all that useful outside of bosses. So in a dungeon, when you're running up to a boss and you're killing all those little mobs, it's not really useful to put up Soul Link at that time, because for the most part, your team should have no problem clearing the mobs before a boss. And if your team is having problems clearing mobs before the boss, it's probably not likely that you're going to be able to beat the boss anyway. So for the most part, you don't need to put up Soul Link when you're just fighting mobs, and you're better off just building up those Datura flowers and saving them for when you reach the boss. But you can still use Soul Link if you really want to, if you're confident that you can have it ready by the time you reach the boss. Now, some bosses have pretty long AoE phases where they do a lot of AoE damage over a pretty long period of time. In those cases, it's best to chain some of these AoE abilities that you have. For example, if you have 4 Datura flowers ready, you can pop Soul Link, then you can use Soul Blossom to heal everybody up, and then you can use Soul Dance to heal everybody up, and then you can use the Inscribed Stone skill to get Soul Blossom again to heal everybody up. So that's what I mean when I say to use this class efficiently, especially in harder dungeons, you have to understand the mechanics of the boss so that you can have these things ready, so you can have those Datura flowers ready, so you can have these skills on cooldown ready to use them when that big, long AoE happens. So your abilities as a healer with this class actually go up and up and up the more you understand bosses and the more you remember when to use these skills. So this is a bit in contrast to the DPS spec, which is more about rolling with the punches and making decisions on the go, whereas this spec, the healing spec, is more about preparation and having the knowledge of what the boss is going to do in advance so you can be ready for it when it happens. That actually is mostly where the difficulty with this class comes from. In fact, I think this is probably one of the, if not the most difficult class in spec to use in this game. And most of that comes from you having to do those dungeons again and again and again, so you have a good understanding of when things will happen inside them. And of course, healing in general is pretty difficult in MMOs because your team can be pretty dumb sometimes and just take way too much damage. And the worse your team is, the more work you'll have to do to make up for them and keep them healthy. Let's talk a little bit now about the ultimates of this class. The first ultimate, Psionic Phantom, is a basic teleportation skill. So if I use one here, I'll teleport forward, and for a small amount of time, I can teleport right back to where I was initially. This isn't super useful in PvE, except to get around and maybe to dodge a boss attack that you couldn't quite make it out of. But in PvP, it is quite useful to get away from sticky situations. The second ultimate, Shadow Speed, is a basic movement speed increase, and as you can see, for 6 seconds I'll just run 50% faster. The third ultimate is called Styx Pulse, and what Styx Pulse does is it'll push enemies around you a considerable distance and then slow or decelerate them. Now this isn't super useful in PvE again because there's not many reasons that you want to be really doing this, but in PvP, this is incredibly useful because if you get crowded in an arena in the battleground, you can push them away, you can slow them down, and in fact, you can gen Psionic Phantom to teleport away. So this combined with this is incredibly powerful in PvP for getting away from those sticky situations. The next skill is in fact actually very useful in PvE, and that's Ghost. What Ghost allows you to do is it allows you to resurrect any dead ally with 50% of their HP. This is obviously very useful in dungeons because if a teammate dies, you can just bring them right back. The downside though is that it has a huge cooldown, 300 seconds, which is 5 minutes, which means that typically you're probably only going to ever resurrect one teammate and maybe two. The next ultimate is Break Free, which basically just removes all root and control effects, but it doesn't work on some boss skills. So because of that, it's not very good in PvE, and it's mostly for PvP, because if you get rooted in PvP, you're kind of probably going to die if you can't break free. The next is very similar, so it removes control and movement restraints, but instead of on yourself, you can remove it from an ally. There is a use for this skill in PvE because it also gets rid of any boss debuffs on the ally that you're using it on. And in fact, there's something cool about this skill, which is that if the ally is not debuffed, it'll look for the next ally to do it to, and if that's not available, then it just won't use the skill. So it is a pretty useful skill in PvE to get rid of those boss debuffs, but still it is quite situational and not always all that necessary. The next skill, Soulbind, is the antithesis to Break Free, in that it basically just creates a root. Not super useful in PvE, again, because you don't really need to root anything. Bosses don't really move around all that much either. But it is very useful for PvP, because if you root an enemy, the rest of your team can jump on them and kill them. The next and final skill is Borrowed Time, which basically for the next 6 seconds allows you to convert a percentage of the damage that you take into healing. I don't really think this skill is very useful for this class because you can heal yourself significantly more than this can heal you, and I have never felt that this gives you all that much more survivability than you already have as a single target healer. So not the best skill, but if anybody has a niche use for it, please let me know. Finally, I want to talk a little bit more about talents. Now, this isn't a build by any means. Like I said, there is no good optimized build at the moment, and mine certainly isn't. But I'll talk a little bit more about talents that I personally quite like. The first one I have is Soul Herb Plus. Now, it increases Soul Herb's healing by a good amount, not Soul Blossoms, Soul Herbs, and it's basically useful because you use Soul Herb as a filler heal between Soul Draw and Tainted Soul, and the increase that you gain from this is pretty noticeable in that it'll just make it a little easier to heal your team. The next skill, Tainted Potential, isn't super useful, but it is nice to have. What it does is it basically makes the target of Tainted Soul, which is this one that gives you 10 vitality, it'll give them a small crit damage boost of 12%. Again, not crazy, nothing game changing, but it's a nice little buff to give your ally. The next skill is Firmness. With this passive, when you use Soul Draw, the target that you use it on gains a pretty nice shield. Now the shield is based on your attack, so it's not anything huge, but it is a nice little boost to the survivability of anyone that you use Soul Draw on. In that same row, I've got Blossom. Blossom is a bit interesting because what it does is when you use Burning Soul, which gives that heal over time, it makes it so that the next time you use Soul Herb to heal an ally, there's a chance, a pretty big chance, for you to gain a Datura Flower. This is pretty useful, and you will notice that your gaining of Datura Flowers has gone up significantly when you use this talent. So I do quite like having it on. The next one is Vile Bloom. Vile Bloom is actually quite strong. So what Vile Bloom does is that when you use Tainted Soul, if the target that you're using Tainted Soul on is linked to you, it'll do a pretty nice AoE heal. Now, if they're not linked to you, you'll gain some extra vitality, but that one's not really all that useful. The more useful thing is that when you use it, if they are linked to you, when you use Tainted Soul, if they are linked to you, you'll do a nice little AoE heal. It's not little, it's pretty significant. So it's a very, very nice talent that I recommend anyone picking up. In the next row, I've got Soul Draw Plus, which is not that crazy. I just needed to put a point somewhere and I thought I'd put it there. Generally though, I wouldn't recommend this because dealing damage and lifesteal are just not things that you need to focus on as a Phantom Necro healer because you're not going to be doing much damage anyway. So that's just kind of a useless talent to have. Rejuvenate, on the other hand, is actually pretty nice. What this does is it makes Soul Herb, again, not Blossom, but just Herb, do extra healing, significantly more healing, when the target has less than 35% of their HP. So when your ally is low on HP, this makes it so that you can spam Soul Herb, which has no cooldown, and quickly get them back up to healthy levels, and then you can use your other single target healing abilities to get them up the rest of the way. So it's a very nice little skill. Then we've got Tainted Soul Plus, which increases the healing done by Tainted Soul a little bit, but more importantly, it reduces the penalty by 18%. Now, if you remember, the penalty is that when you use Tainted Soul to heal an ally, over time, they lose 50% of that healing. With this passive, that loss is reduced by 18%. So it's quite nice to have. The next passive I've selected in that same row is actually kind of broken, and that's Burning Soul Plus. This passive makes Burning Soul, instead of increasing the target's HP by 10%, it's going to increase it by another 40% and then increase the heal over time by 25%. So this is definitely something I 100% recommend picking up no matter what. The final passive I've got is Flourish, which basically just gives me a few vitality points every few seconds when I'm in a fight. This isn't too impactful, but it does add a nice little boost to your Datura Flower generation, so you can always be ready to use Soul Link. So that's pretty much everything for the Phantom Necromancer's healer spec. Once again, this is a very, very fun class with probably the highest skill ceiling in the entire game because it kind of depends on you being able to understand, remember, and utilize the boss mechanics, knowing when they're going to use those big AoE attacks so you can have those big AoE heals ready to save and then bring your team back up to full. And that difficulty is actually what makes this class so fun. And once you've mastered it and you've got that understanding of those boss mechanics, you're significantly better than the priest, but it just requires a lot more effort to get there. So I hope that this guide has either encouraged you to give this spec a try or helped you understand it a little bit better so you can do a bit better in your dungeons and raids. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.